The morning Renata told me to pack my things, she was standing at the kitchen counter eating yogurt from a glass jar. She didn't even turn around. She just spoke to the wall in front of her like I was already a formality she had decided to dispense with. "You have until Friday," she said. "That's 4 days." I was still holding my coffee cup. The ceramic was warm against my palms. My father had bought it at a craft market in Vermont, the summer before he got sick. He'd paid $12 for it, which was more than he would have paid for a mug anywhere else. And when I teased him about it on the drive home, he laughed and said some things are worth paying more for if they make you feel something in the morning. I had been using it every day since he passed, because it was the kind of small, specific habit that helps a person keep moving when the larger things have stopped making sense. "This is still my father's house," I said. Renata turned around then. Not with anger. Not with cruelty. Either of those would have been easier to argue with. She turned around with patience, the particular patience of someone who has already won and simply hasn't gotten around to announcing it. "It's mine now," she said. "The will is clear. You can take your personal belongings. There's a storage unit on Route 9 if you need space for boxes." She went back to her yogurt. I stood in that kitchen doorway for another moment. Not because I thought anything would change if I stood there long enough. I stood because leaving meant accepting that the house was no longer mine. And while I had known that since the afternoon I sat in the attorney's office on Birch Street and heard the will read aloud, knowing a thing and allowing yourself to feel it are two different processes. They don't always run on the same schedule. I set the coffee cup in the dish rack. Then I went upstairs and started packing. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. My father's name was Owen Calloway. He was a tall man who moved slowly, not from weakness, but from a kind of deliberateness, as though he had decided early in life that most things worth doing were worth doing at the right pace. He had large hands, built for outdoor work, and he used them for everything. He fixed his own fences, rebuilt the back porch twice, repaired every appliance in the house at least once before he'd agree to replace it. He said it was practical. My mother used to say it was stubbornness dressed up as common sense, and they both laughed when she said it, which tells you something about the way things were between them when she was still alive. She died when I was 9. Ovarian cancer, caught late, moving fast once it was found. I remember very little of the hospital. I remember a lot of the house afterward, the way it changed in small ways once she was gone. The way the kitchen went quiet in the mornings, because she had always had something going, bread rising or broth on the stove, or coffee strong enough to smell from the hallway. My father kept the house clean and fed me properly and showed up to everything I needed him to show up to, but the kitchen stayed quiet. That particular kind of quiet is different from silence. Silence is just the absence of sound. What I mean is something specific to a place, a quality that changes when a person who brought something to a room is no longer there. He ran a farm supply business on the county road north of town. Calloway Feed and Hardware, a low cinder block building with a hand-painted sign that had faded to the point where you mostly read it from memory if you'd been coming there long enough. He carried what working farms actually needed: seed, fencing materials, the specific bolts and brackets and motors that kept equipment running through seasons of constant use. Farmers drove 40 minutes to get things from him because he knew what he was selling and because he was honest about what would work and what wouldn't. He had a reputation for that. People trusted him because he had never given them a reason not to. The barn at the north end of the property on Mill Creek Road had been part of the original Calloway land, his grandfather's originally. By the time my father inherited it, the farm itself was long gone, sold off in pieces over the decades until what remained was the house on Sycamore, the feed store on County Road 7, and roughly 3 acres of scrub and field running up to the tree line, with the old barn sitting at the far edge of it. He used to store inventory there when the shop was busier, surplus feed in the dry months, equipment waiting for repair. By the time I was a teenager, the inventory had moved to a proper storage unit behind the store, and the barn mostly held the things that accumulate in a barn when no one is watching it too carefully. Old machinery, scrap lumber, a tractor that hadn't run since the 90s, equipment belonging to neighbors that had been stored there temporarily and then simply remained because no one ever came back for it. He called it the mill barn. I don't know if it had ever actually been a mill. That's just what he called it, the way families name things after long enough, the way a name loses its original meaning and becomes simply a sound attached to a specific place. Renata came into our lives when I was 22. My father was 60 at the time, and I had been watching him, without quite knowing I was watching him, for signs that the quiet was getting heavier. He had friends, men he'd known for decades, and he was good company with them, easy and warm and capable of laughing at things that actually deserve to be laughed at. But there is a difference between a person who is managing well and a person who is genuinely all right, and I had never been fully certain which one he was. He met Renata at a Chamber of Commerce dinner in the spring. She was 54, recently divorced from her second husband, who had been in commercial real estate somewhere in the Northeast before things went badly for them. She wore good clothes and spoke carefully and had a way of being in a conversation that made you feel she was paying attention even when you weren't sure she was. My father introduced her to me over the phone 3 weeks after they met, which was not like him. He was not a man who rushed things. She was pleasant when I met her in person. I want to be honest about that. She brought a bottle of wine to dinner at the house and asked me questions about my job, which at the time was at a landscape architecture firm in the city 2 hours south, and she listened to my answers in the way that some people genuinely do and some people only perform. I could not tell immediately which one she was. I told myself that was just because I didn't know her yet. My father married her 14 months later. I flew home for the ceremony, which was small, a judge and a few close friends and the back garden of the house on Sycamore. He looked happy in a way I hadn't seen him look in years, and I told myself that was the thing that mattered, that he had found something that made the house less quiet, and that I should be glad. I was glad. Mostly. There is a version of glad that lives right next to something else, something you don't name, because naming it seems like a failure of character. I was aware of that other thing and chose not to examine it, which is something people do when the right feeling is available and easier to hold on to. The changes were gradual. They almost always are. The first was the store. Renata suggested a renovation, updating the signage, refreshing the inventory toward a broader market, adding items that would pull in customers who weren't working farmers, weekend gardeners, people building hobby homesteads. My father resisted initially, the way he resisted anything that moved too fast, and then slowly came around. The sign changed. New fixtures went in. Some of the old inventory lines were dropped in favor of things with better margins. I came home that first Christmas and walked through the store, and it was different in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Not worse exactly, just not the same. The reputation the store had built over 30 years was built on a particular kind of trust, and trust like that is specific to what you're doing when you build it. Change what you're doing, and you don't always carry the trust along with you. He didn't say anything about it to me directly. My father was not a man who complained, partly from temperament and partly, I think, because complaining about the woman he'd married would have felt to him like an admission that he'd made a mistake, and admitting mistakes required a kind of excavation he generally avoided. The second change was harder to name. It was the quality of his attention when I called. He had always picked up on the first ring when it was me. That's such a small thing that saying it out loud sounds like the beginning of a complaint I shouldn't be making. But there was a period, roughly 18 months, during which the calls went longer before he answered, and then periods where he called back hours later, and when we spoke he was often a little somewhere else in a way that was new. I told myself he was busy. The store was in transition. Life contracts and expands around what it's dealing with. He got his diagnosis in the fall of the year I turned 29. Parkinson's. Early stage, but present, and the neurologist was straightforward about the trajectory. He called me himself to tell me, which was the most like himself I'd heard him in months. Direct, calm, practical about what it meant for the near future, and honest about what it meant for the further one. I drove home that weekend, and we sat on the back porch and drank coffee, and he told me he wasn't afraid of it. He said it more than once, which is how I knew it wasn't entirely true. Fear doesn't need repeating when it's absent. But he was managing it the way he managed most things, by refusing to give it more space than it had already taken. The next 2 years were the ones that mattered most to the shape of this story, though I didn't understand that while I was living through them. I was in and out. My job was in the city, and I couldn't move back permanently, and my father didn't ask me to. Renata was there, and whatever my reservations about her, she was present in the practical ways that presence requires. She drove him to appointments. She managed the medications, which were not simple and became less simple as time went on. She handled the household bills, the store paperwork, The 100 logistical pieces of a life that becomes harder to manage on your own. I noticed, on my visits, that more decisions were moving through her. That the accounts she mentioned were accounts I hadn't known about. That the store had shifted further from what it had been, and that my father, when I asked about it, gave answers that were shorter than they used to be. Not evasive, just shorter. Like a man who had gotten used to not being the one who explained things anymore. I noticed. I did not say enough about what I noticed. That is the part one take responsibility for. He died on a Tuesday in March. He was 68 years old, and the last year had been hard, and I had been there twice in that final month. I was there at the end, which I am grateful for. There are things you cannot get back if you miss them, and that was not one of them. The week after the funeral, Renata moved through the house in the specific way of a person handling logistics under pressure, which I understood. Grief doesn't suspend the need for decisions. She made calls and responded to mail and prepared food that neither of us ate much of and accepted condolences from people who came by bearing casseroles and gentleness. We were polite. We were careful. The house was full of my father in the way that a space is full of someone who is no longer in it. And I think we were both moving carefully around that fullness, not wanting to disrupt it before we had to. The attorney's office was on Birch Street, above a sandwich shop that smelled of toasted bread and coffee, even on the second floor. I sat in a chair that faced the window and looked at the back of the building across the alley while the attorney, whose name was Pelham, read the will. He was methodical and unsentimental in the way attorneys are trained to be, and I appreciated that. It was not a moment I wanted stretched. The house on Sycamore went to Renata. The store and its assets went to Renata, with provisions for a small pension structure for his two long-term employees, Gus and Ray, who had worked there for 22 and 16 years respectively. Personal items were listed specifically. A watch went to his brother in Tucson. Books to his friend Marv. Tools to Gus, which I thought my father would have wanted even if it hadn't been written down. And then Pelham came to my name. May Calloway receives the parcel of land and structure commonly known as the Mill Barn, located at the north boundary of the Calloway Mill Creek property, consisting of the barn structure and approximately half an acre of surrounding land. He set the paper down. That was it. My father had left me a barn. Renata was looking at the far wall, while Pelham continued. I watched her profile for a moment. She was already somewhere past this moment, already in the logistics of what came next. She had the posture of a person who has prepared for a meeting and confirmed the outcome before arriving. Pelham asked if there were questions. I said no. Renata said no. We signed where we were asked to sign. I shook his hand. We went out into the hallway, and I pushed the button for the elevator, and we stood there in the particular silence of two people who have nothing left to say to each other in that moment. You can do whatever you want with the barn, Renata said, as the elevator doors opened. Sell it, if you can find a buyer. The land's not worth much this far from the road. She stepped in. It's been years since anything useful was in there, she said. There's really nothing. The doors closed. I stood in the hallway for a moment. The smell of toasted bread drifted up from the floor below. A water stain on the ceiling tile had the shape of something I couldn't identify. I pushed the button again and rode down alone. Nothing. She had said there was nothing. My father was a man who didn't give you things that were nothing. He didn't do anything carelessly or without consideration. He bought a $12 coffee mug because he wanted to feel something specific every morning. He kept records of everything he repaired and why. He had named the same barn the same name for 40 years because it was the name it had, and changing it would have required a reason that hadn't presented itself. He had left me a barn. I drove out to Mill Creek Road that afternoon. I hadn't planned to. I had told myself I would sort out my immediate situation first, which was considerable. I had a month left on my lease in the city. My job was remote enough that I could manage from anywhere for a while, but I had things to figure out about where I was going to be and how. And then I found myself turning onto Mill Creek Road at 4 in the afternoon on a gray March day, gravel crunching under the tires, the bare trees close on both sides of the track. I parked where the track ended, in the flat open ground in front of the barn, and sat in the car for a moment. From the outside it looked exactly as I remembered it. Large, weathered, the boards silver gray with age and exposure. The roof was still standing, which mattered more than anything else from a practical standpoint. The main doors were shut, the old iron hardware gone to rust at the edges, and the siding had gaps where boards had warped and pulled away from their supports. Overgrown grass around the foundation. A collapsed section of fence along the east side. A crabapple tree at the corner that had gotten large enough to press against the siding. Nothing, Renata had said. I got out of the car. The air smelled of wet earth and old wood, and something else I couldn't immediately place, something slightly metallic and faintly pleasant, like the inside of a toolbox that has been in use for a long time. I noticed it before I'd reached the doors and stopped for a moment, trying to locate it more precisely. It wasn't decay. Decay has a specific quality, and this was different. The main doors were held by a steel bar resting in two brackets, the old locking method that required no key, just a lift and a pull. I lifted the bar, set it against the wall, and pulled the right side door. It was heavier than I expected, not from neglect, but from solid framing, the kind that doesn't come in prefab structures. The hinges were well mounted. The doors swung in a clean arc. I stepped inside. The light was low, coming through two windows on the south wall and the gap at the door. Dust moved slowly in the shaft of afternoon light from outside, the way it does in a space that hasn't been disturbed in the last hour or two. I waited for my eyes to adjust. The first thing I noticed was the floor. I had expected packed dirt, the way the barn floor had always been as far back as I could remember, soft in the rain months and cracked in summer. But there were sections where the dirt had been cleared and replaced with concrete. Not rough-poured concrete, but finished, flat, level. It had been done in two distinct areas, each about the size of a large room, running from the north wall toward the center. The seams between the concrete and the old earth floor were clean and deliberate. This had been done carefully, not quickly. The second thing I noticed was the shelving. Along the west wall, floor-to-ceiling metal shelving, the kind used in commercial workshops, with brackets. Bolted into the wall studs at regular intervals. The shelves held containers, clearly labeled in handwriting I knew without needing to look twice. My father's handwriting. Small, even letters, consistent pressure. He wrote the same way he did everything else. The containers were organized by type. Fasteners at one end. Lubricants next to them. Hand tools on the lower shelves, laid in with the kind of care that means you put them back in the same place every time, not because you have to, but because you know that's the only way a system stays a system. I walked toward the shelving slowly. The metallic smell was stronger here. Not machinery oil, something finer, almost like the inside of a watch case. My hand went to the nearest label without thinking. I read it. I read the next one. And the one after. He had been out here. Not in the past. Not in the vague historical sense of the barn having been used for storage. Recently. The container labels were not faded. The tools on the lower shelves were not dusty in the way that tools get dusty when they've been sitting for years. There was the light accumulation of a month, maybe two, not more. The handles were clean from use, the metal surfaces showing the small scratches of regular handling. My father had been working out here. I stood very still and looked at the shelving and at the poured concrete floor and at the organized, carefully maintained space that was supposed to be nothing. The space Renata had described as years since anything useful. The space she had handed to me because she had assumed it was worthless. I turned slowly and looked at the full interior of the barn. At the far end, beyond the concrete sections, the original dirt floor continued, and in that section I could now make out shapes I hadn't fully registered when I first walked in. Large shapes, some covered with canvas tarps, some not. Equipment of some kind. The light didn't reach clearly, and I hadn't brought a flashlight, and the afternoon was moving toward evening, and the gray outside was getting grayer. But there was one shape I recognized before I got any closer, because I had seen it before. In photographs. In a magazine my father had kept on his desk in the feed store for years, a machinery and vintage equipment publication he'd subscribed to long enough that it had become part of the furniture of that desk. The shape under the canvas was a tractor. Not the broken-down one I remembered from childhood, not the one from the 90s that hadn't run since. The proportions were different. The silhouette was something else entirely. I took 2 steps toward it. Then I stopped. On the workbench built against the east wall, beneath the south-facing window, there was something I had walked past without registering on the way in. A metal box, olive green, the kind that latches on the front. Military surplus style, the type used for tool storage or document protection. It was sitting in the center of the workbench, not pushed to the side the way things get pushed to the side when they're incidental. It was placed there, in the center, with deliberate space around it on either side. I went to it. The latch was not locked. It lifted cleanly. Inside was a brown envelope, letter-sized, sealed. And beneath it, A small notebook, the kind with the hard black cover that you find at hardware stores, which my father had used for record-keeping for as long as I could remember. He went through 3 or 4 of them a year. They were not sentimental objects to him. They were working documents. The envelope had my name on it. Not printed. Written. His handwriting. May. I picked it up and held it, and stood in the half-light of that barn with the dust settling around me, and the wind moving in the grass outside, and my own breathing the only other sound. The paper was slightly waxy, the good kind, the kind that resists moisture. He had chosen it carefully. Of course he had. I held the envelope, and I did not open it right away. I think I was not ready, in that moment, for what it would say, because whatever was in there, he had left it for me to find, and he had expected Renata to give me the barn, and he had expected her to say it was nothing. He had put this here anyway, knowing she would say nothing, trusting that if I came, I would find it. He had known something. He had known it and planned for it, and the plan was this barn, and this box, and this envelope with my name on it in his handwriting. I set the envelope back in the box. I took the notebook, just for a moment, and opened to the first page. The date at the top was 8 months before he died. The handwriting was unsteady in places, the way his writing had gotten in the last year when the tremor in his right hand was bad. But the words were precise and specific, the way he always was, because my father did not know how to write anything carelessly. The first line read, "If you're reading this, May, you came to the barn." I closed the notebook. I put it back in the box. I closed the latch. I stood there with my hands on the cool metal surface and looked at the barn around me, at the concrete floor, at the shelving, at the shapes under the tarps at the far end, at the tractor silhouette. Renata had told me this place was worthless. She had said it the way she said most things, with patience and the confidence of someone who doesn't expect to be questioned. What she did not know, and what I was only beginning to understand, was that my father had been coming here. He had been working. He had been building something in this barn while the house behind him got quieter and the decisions moved further from his hands. He had been here, in this space, doing something he hadn't told her about, and he had left the evidence of it for me. The gray afternoon outside had gone to early dark by the time I walked back to the car. I sat behind the wheel and looked at the barn through the windshield. The door was closed again, the bar back in its brackets. From the outside, you could not tell that anything inside was different from what it appeared to be. Old. Overgrown. Nothing. He had been counting on exactly that. I drove back toward town slowly, the headlights picking up the gravel of Mill Creek Road in sections. I had nowhere to be that evening. The storage unit on Route 9 could wait. The questions about my apartment and my job and where I was going to put my boxes could wait. Everything that had felt urgent that morning felt like the wrong category of thing now. Because my father had left me something. Not nothing. Not the remnant of a forgotten farm. Something he had put there on purpose. Something Renata had handed over with the confidence that it was worthless. And I was only beginning to understand that it was anything but. I didn't go back the next morning. I wanted to. The pull toward that barn was specific and constant from the moment I woke up, which was early, on the narrow couch in my friend Bess's spare room, where I had been staying since the funeral arrangements had started. I lay there in the gray light and thought about the envelope with my name on it and the notebook with the unsteady handwriting and the shapes under the tarps. I didn't go back because I needed to think carefully about what I knew and who I said it to before I understood the full shape of what my father had left. Renata didn't know I had gone to the barn yet. She might find out. The county road was visible from the end of the Mill Creek track, and anyone who knew the property would know a car parked there meant someone at the barn. But she hadn't called. She hadn't reached out since the morning at the kitchen counter, which was consistent with the way she operated. She handled things in advance and then waited. She was not a person who chased after conclusions already drawn. But she had also said there was nothing. She had said it with the confidence of someone who had checked, or who had been told, or who assumed without checking because she had no reason to believe anything valuable was there. I didn't know yet which of those it was, and the distinction mattered. I sat up on the couch and looked at Bess's living room in the morning light. Plants on every surface. A stack of library books. A dog-eared paperback on the armrest of the good chair. Bess was still sleeping, one of her recovery mornings after a late shift at the hospital. I was careful not to make noise with the kettle. I had two things in front of me. The problem I could see clearly, and the problem I couldn't see yet. The problem I could see clearly was that I had no permanent address, limited savings, and a job that paid adequately but not generously. One that had tolerated remote work for a while, but was now drifting back toward in-person expectations. That problem had a shape and a timeline and required practical decisions. The problem I couldn't see yet was the barn. What my father had built there. What the notebook said in full. What was under the tarps. What was in the envelope with my name on it, which I had not opened, which I had chosen to leave in the box on the workbench because I had not been ready. I poured my coffee and sat at Bess's kitchen table, and I made a list in the margin of a free newspaper she'd left there. Not the full list, just the next few steps. The first thing on the list was a different attorney. Not Pelham, who had handled the will and whose professional relationship was to the estate broadly. Someone outside that system, someone who could tell me clearly what I owned and what it meant to own it, and whether there were any encumbrances or liens on the barn property I needed to know about. Ownership is sometimes less than it looks on paper, and I wanted to be certain about the land before I did anything else. The second thing was a conversation with Gus. Gus Fenner had worked for my father at the feed store for 22 years. He was a quiet man, not unfriendly, just economical with words in the way of people who work with their hands and don't see much use in saying something 5 times when once will do. He had known my father longer than Renata had. He had received the tools in the will. My father had been specific about which tools went to Gus, and that specificity told me Gus had been in the barn, had seen those tools, had known where they were. I wanted to talk to Gus. I called his cell phone number, which I still had from years back, and it rang 3 times before he picked up. He said my name without any particular surprise, like he'd been expecting the call. I went to the barn, I said. A pause. Short, but present. All right, he said. Can we meet somewhere? I asked. Another pause. Longer. Mornings I'm at the diner on Elm, he said. 7 to 8. Before the store opens. Tomorrow. I said. Whenever you're ready, he said. He hung up first. That was Gus. I looked at the list in the newspaper margin. I had written 2 things. I added a third. Go back to the barn. Take the envelope. I had been afraid of it the day before. Not of what the envelope said specifically, but of what it would mean to know. Because knowing changes the weight of every decision after it. Whatever my father had written to me, once I read it, I would be responsible for it. The way you're responsible for a thing once you've seen it and can no longer claim you didn't. I was ready to be responsible for it. Bess came out of her bedroom at 8:30 in her scrubs, hair still loose, squinting at the kitchen light. She looked at me and at the newspaper margin and at the coffee cup that was cold because I'd forgotten to drink it. How long have you been up? She said. A while, I said. She poured herself coffee and looked at me more carefully. Bess has been my closest friend since we were both 17, working the same summer job at the garden center on Route 14, pulling weeds and hauling mulch in the August heat. And after 20 years, she has a working knowledge of what my face does when I am thinking about something I haven't said yet. The barn, she said. It wasn't a question. The barn, I agreed. She sat down across from me. Outside, a delivery truck backed down the street with its slow beeping. A neighbor's dog barked twice and stopped. Did you find something? She said. I don't know yet what I found, I said. I know there's something. She nodded. She didn't press for details. That's one of the things I've always valued about Bess, the understanding that some things need to be organized before they can be spoken. Stay as long as you need, she said. I mean it. No timeline. I know, I said. Thank you. We sat with our coffee in the ordinary quiet of a weekday morning. Traffic building on the main road 2 blocks over. The dog again, and then silence. Somewhere, Renata was in the house on Sycamore, moving through mornings that were now legally entirely hers. The store on County Road 7 was opening with a different sign and different inventory, and Gus was unlocking the front door the way he'd been unlocking it for 22 years. And in the barn on Mill Creek Road, in an olive green metal box on a workbench my father had built, an envelope weighted with my name on it in his handwriting. I drove out there that afternoon. The light was better than the day before, a thin March sun coming through the south windows and reaching further into the interior than the gray of yesterday had allowed. I propped the main door open with the steel bar and stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking. It felt like his presence, being in that space. Not in a mystical sense. In the specific sense that a space shaped by a particular person retains the evidence of how they moved through it. The shelving at shoulder height, because that was the comfortable reach for a tall man. The workbench at exactly the right elevation for someone of his height. The containers organized from left to right in the order of use. The things you reached for most at the near end. All of it calibrated to him. All of it his. I walked to the workbench. The olive green box was where I'd left it. I opened the latch. The envelope was there. The notebook beneath it. I took the envelope. I went to the workbench stool, which was a heavy wooden thing, handmade. The kind that doesn't have a back, because you're not supposed to get comfortable enough to stop working. I sat on it, and I opened the envelope. There were 4 pages inside. He had written in pen, a heavy ballpoint that put down a solid line. The handwriting was careful and slower than his usual, compensating for the tremor, but the letters were his. Unmistakably his. He began the way I would have expected him to begin. If you're reading this, you came to the barn. That's the first thing, and I'm glad. I'm not going to write much preamble, because that's not the kind of letter you need right now. I'll tell you what I need you to know. I'll tell you what I've been doing out here. I'll tell you why I kept it separate. And then I'll tell you what I'd like you to do with it, which is not an instruction, because you're grown and the decision is yours. It's a request. From someone who should have talked to you about some of this a long time ago and didn't. I stayed on the stool and read all 4 pages straight through. The light moved in the south windows as I read, the thin sun tracking across the floor in the slow way it does in late winter, when the angle is low and the hours feel longer than they are. When I finished reading, I sat for a while with the pages in my hands. He had been coming to the barn for 3 years. Not every day. Some weeks he came twice. Some months, once. He brought tools from the store, duplicates of stock that Renata hadn't known to inventory. He brought materials in his truck, small enough quantities that the receipts looked like normal restocking rather than private project work. He had been restoring things. That's what the shapes under the tarps were. Vintage agricultural equipment. 3 tractors and a piece of antique harvesting machinery from the early 20th century. The kind of thing that turns up at auction houses specializing in historic equipment. The kind that has collectors who pay prices that would astonish anyone who walked past it in a field and assumed it was scrap. He had not told Renata. He wrote about that plainly, without accusation, but plainly. He said there were things about money that had changed between them in the last few years, things he hadn't managed as carefully as he should have, and he had come to understand that what he kept separate was what he could be certain of. He named specific people in the letter. A dealer in Ohio who specialized in this category of equipment. A buyer in Pennsylvania who had already expressed interest in the harvesting machine specifically and had communicated a figure that I had to read twice to believe was real. A man in the county, a retired machinist named Del Soward, who had helped him with engine work on 2 of the tractors and who knew what was here. And then the last paragraph. I'm not asking you to fight anyone, May. I'm not asking you to make this harder than it has to be. What I'm asking is that you understand that this barn is not nothing. It never was. And the half-acre around it has a clean title, no encumbrances, and it's yours outright, the same way the mug I bought in Vermont is yours outright. Because I gave it to you. Because I wanted you to have something that no one could rearrange without your permission. You know where the keys are. I looked up from the letter. You know where the keys are. I did not know where the keys were. He had not said explicitly, but he had said you know, which meant he believed I would understand where to look. He had trusted that I would find it, the way he trusted me to find everything else. I folded the 4 pages back along their original creases and put them in the envelope and put the envelope back in the box. Then I picked up the notebook and opened it to the first page. It was a project log, dated entries, specific, the way he kept every record. Engine work completed on Tractor 1. Parts sourced from the dealer in Ohio, cost, date, supplier. Progress on the harvesting machine, specific mechanical issues, solutions, hours spent. Notes on the 3rd tractor, which had come to him in the worst condition and which he had worked on the longest. Interspersed with the mechanical notes were other entries. Financial ones. Figures associated with the Ohio dealer. Projected values based on current auction results for comparable equipment. A list of interested buyers with names and contact details and the prices they had indicated. A separate column tracking what he had spent against what the equipment was currently worth. The numbers in that column were not small. I read through the notebook slowly. The light in the barn had shifted by the time I looked up again. Late afternoon, the sun going down behind the tree line on the west side. The barn interior going to shadow in the corners. The keys. He had said I would know. I stood up and walked slowly along the east wall, looking. There was a pegboard section near the main door, the type with hooks for hanging things. A flashlight. a small coil of wire, a measuring tape, and at the far end of the pegboard, a row of small hooks from which hung 4 keys. Old style, substantial, the kind that go to padlocks and older door locks rather than modern cylinders. Beneath the hooks, a piece of masking tape on the pegboard surface. Written on it in his handwriting, T1, T2, T3, H, 3 tractors, H. I looked at the 4th key. It was different from the others. Larger, more complex. Not the same type at all. H. I didn't know what H was yet, but I knew I would find out. The barn was going dark, and I had the letter and the notebook and 4 keys and more than I had been able to process in a single afternoon. I took the metal box with me this time, carried it to the car, and set it on the passenger seat, and sat there for a moment before I started the engine. Renata had handed me a worthless barn. She had said it with the certainty of someone who had looked and decided and moved on. What she had not counted on, and what I was only beginning to understand, was that my father had been counting on exactly that. The certainty, the dismissal. He had kept his work invisible because he had understood, before I did, what the shape of things had become, and he had put everything he had built here in a place she would hand away without a second thought. He had sealed it with my name on an envelope and left it for me to find. The store on County Road 7 was dark as I drove past. The new sign glowed faintly in the parking lot light. I thought about what the store had been and what it had become. I thought about the things my father had not said about either. Then I thought about the 4th key, H. I drove toward town with the metal box on the seat beside me and a feeling I hadn't had since the morning the elevator doors closed and left me alone in that hallway on Birch Street. The feeling was not hope exactly. It was something steadier than hope. It was the beginning of understanding. The point where you stop standing in the dark and start being able to make out the edges of things. My father had not left me nothing. He had left me everything he could protect. And the half-acre on Mill Creek Road was just the beginning of it. The meeting with Gus the next morning was at the diner on Elm, as promised, at 7 o'clock. I arrived before him. The diner was the kind of place that has been the same for 30 years and succeeds entirely because of that consistency. Same booths, same laminated menus with photographs of the specials, the same smell of coffee and bacon grease and dishwater that is deeply unromantic and deeply comforting in equal measure. Gus arrived at 7 on the dot. He was a man of 60 or so, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of weathered hands that spend most of their time in contact with metal or wood. He hung his jacket on the booth hook, ordered coffee without looking at the menu, and looked at me with the calm, unhurried expression of a man who had decided before he arrived how much he was going to say. "How much did he tell you in the letter?" he asked. "Enough," I said, "but not everything." He nodded once, like that was the answer he'd expected. "He came to me 2 years ago," Gus said. "Said he'd found 3 machines. 2 at an estate auction in Indiana, and 1 from a retired farmer over in Crane County who didn't know what he had. Said he needed someone who understood engines and could help him work on them without making it a project that got back to the store." "He trusted you," I said. "We'd worked together 22 years, Gus said, and I think he needed someone to trust." He said that last part quietly, without embellishment, and I let it sit between us for a moment. "The harvesting machine," I said. "The Pennsylvania buyer. Fellow named Hargrove," Gus said. "Called your father directly after he saw a photograph at a show your father attended in Columbus. Owen never confirmed ownership, just said he knew of a machine in that condition and was exploring options. Hargrove said he'd been looking for one for 6 years." "What was the figure he mentioned?" Gus looked at his coffee for a moment. Then he said the number. I set down my cup carefully. The number was not small. It was not the kind of number that makes a person rich overnight. It was the kind of number that pays off a lease and covers a year and gives you enough ground to stand on that the decisions in front of you stop feeling like emergencies. "That's just one machine," I said. "That's just one machine," Gus agreed. I looked out the window at the street. A woman walked past with a dog and a coffee cup. A delivery van idled at the light. Ordinary Tuesday morning. The world unaware that in a booth in this diner a conversation was taking place that had been quietly building for 3 years. "Did Renata ever ask you about the barn?" I said. Gus's expression didn't change much, but something shifted in it, just slightly. "Once," he said, "about 6 weeks before Owen passed. She came into the store and asked me, casual-like, whether I'd been helping Owen with any projects on the property." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I helped him sometimes with maintenance things." Nothing specific. He paused. She asked whether there was anything valuable stored out there. I waited. I told her I didn't know of anything, he said, which was true in the way that the right words can be true without being the whole truth. He drank his coffee. I drank mine. Outside, the light was getting brighter as the morning moved along. He was protecting it, I said. Not a question. He was making sure it went where he intended, Gus said. He was specific about that. He said whatever happened with the estate, the barn had a clean title and he'd made sure of it. I thought about what Pelham had read. A parcel of land and structure commonly known as the mill barn. Half an acre, clean and separate from the rest of the estate, which Renata now controlled entirely. My father had separated it deliberately. He had made it mine in the will not because it was the only thing left to give, but because it was the one thing he was certain would go to me undisturbed. He had packaged 3 years of quiet, careful, deliberate work into a half-acre parcel and a barn that looked like nothing from the outside and handed it to Renata to give away, knowing she would, knowing she'd call it worthless and walk away without looking twice. She had done exactly what he expected. Del Soward, I said. The machinist. Del retired from the county public works about 4 years back, Gus said. He and Owen got to talking at a machinery show in the fall. Del's the one who worked the engine on tractor number 2. Knows his work. More importantly, knows the market for this type of equipment. Would he talk to me? He's been waiting for you to ask, Gus said. He slid a piece of paper across the table. A phone number, written in the kind of neat block print that retired engineers tend to use, precise and even. He said Owen told him his daughter would come eventually, Gus said. Said he wanted to make sure you had someone to call who knew the full picture. I folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket. The full picture. I was beginning to understand how many pieces that picture had, how carefully and quietly and over how long a time my father had assembled them, and how completely Renata had been wrong about all of it. She had said there was nothing in that barn. What there was 3 years of my father's most careful work. 3 restored machines with a market she didn't know existed and buyers who were already waiting. A project log in his handwriting documenting every hour, every dollar, every decision. And a 4th key on a hook with a label I didn't yet understand. I drove to the barn that afternoon for the 3rd time in as many days. I brought a better flashlight. I brought the metal box. I brought the letter and the notebook and the list of names and numbers my father had given me. I brought all of it because I was not going back empty-handed anymore. Inside, I went directly to the tarps. The first one I lifted was over the machine Gus had called tractor number 2. Underneath, it was a 1948 Oliver 88, painted in what I would later learn was a near-perfect restoration of the original meadow green, with decals reapplied from period-accurate sources and chrome on the fittings that caught even the thin barn light and gave it back doubled. It was not simply repaired. It was restored with the specific attention of someone who understood that the point was not to make an old machine functional, but to make it true again, to return it to what it had been before time and use had worn away the original intention. I stood beside it with my hand on the metal of the hood and thought about my father working out here in the evenings. The tremor in his hand when it was bad. The cold in a barn in winter when the medication wasn't managing things well. The patience required to do this kind of work when your body is working against you. He had done it anyway. He had come out here and done it anyway, and he had done it well. I went to the harvesting machine at the far end, the one with the Pennsylvania buyer. Even under its tarp, it was large, imposing, the kind of machine that was built in an era when everything was built to last longer than the people who made it. When I pulled the canvas back, I stood for a long moment just looking. It was a 1920s-era grain separator, horse-drawn originally, restored to a condition I couldn't have imagined for something that old. The wood components were refinished. The metal was treated against rust. The mechanical parts, from what I could see, were in working order or close to it. Hargrove in Pennsylvania had called a figure for this machine that I'd had to read twice to believe. Looking at it now, standing in a barn on a cold March afternoon in a county where no one had thought to look, I understood why. The 4th tarp I left for last. Tractor number 3. The one my father's notes said had been in the worst condition, the one he'd worked on the longest. I pulled the canvas back slowly. It was a 1936 John Deere Model B. The restoration was not complete. I could see that immediately, the way you can see the difference between a finished thing and a thing in progress when you're looking closely. The body had been refinished, but the engine was partially disassembled, components laid out on a canvas drop cloth beside it in the careful, organized manner of someone who intended to return to this work and knew exactly where each piece would go when they did. He hadn't finished it. I stood there and looked at the disassembled engine laid out on the floor, and I thought about what that meant. That there had been a day when he last worked on this machine, some afternoon in the last months of his life when the tremor was worse and the light was going, and he had put down his tools and left the engine laid out for the next time, not knowing that the next time would not come, not knowing that this particular day was the last one. The parts were labeled. Of course they were. Each one on a small square of masking tape with a number in his handwriting, ordered so that whoever returned to this project would know exactly the sequence in which things went back together. He had labeled the parts so that whoever came would be able to finish it. Whoever came. I picked up the masking tape tag on the nearest component and read the number. Then I picked up the next one. And the next. They were sequential and complete, every component accounted for, the order of reassembly clear. Not a note left in crisis. A plan left with intention, by a man who knew this work would be continued even if he wasn't the one to continue it. He had known I would find this. He had known I would come. And he had made sure that when I did, I could pick up exactly where he had left off. I stood up slowly. The barn was quiet around me. The late afternoon light came through the south windows in flat pale bars and lay across the floor and across the disassembled engine and across the canvas covering the other machines, and I stood in the middle of it and held the key ring with the 4 keys. T1, T2, T3, H. I turned and looked at the barn again with different eyes, trying to see what I had been missing. There were the tarps, the shelving, the workbench, the concrete floor sections, the pegboard near the door, the main beams running the length of the roof above, darkened with age. And then, in the far corner of the north wall, something I had not noticed before. Not a door exactly, more of a fitted panel, the kind of thing that reads as wall until you're close enough to see the edges. A panel with a flush-mounted lock, the kind of lock that takes a larger, more complex key. The kind of lock the 4th key would fit. I walked toward it slowly. The panel was well fitted, flush with the surrounding boards, the gap around the edges thin enough to overlook in the low light. There was no handle, just the lock, set into the wood, waiting. I took the 4th key from the ring. I put it in the lock. It turned. The panel swung inward on well-oiled hinges, quiet and smooth, opening onto a small space behind the north wall, a room within the barn, 6 feet wide and perhaps 10 feet deep, that I had not known existed. Inside, the air was different. Dry, controlled. There was a small dehumidifier in the corner, plugged into an extension cord that ran to an outlet I hadn't noticed, and its quiet hum was the only sound. The walls were lined with shelving, and on the shelving were boxes, files, and 3 things that stopped me before I could take a full inventory. The first was a folder, thick, with my name on it. Not May on a brown envelope. My full name, in formal print. May Owen Calloway. The second was a set of documents in a clear sleeve, stamped and signed, official in a way that made the back of my neck go warm. The third was a framed photograph I had never seen before. My father, young, standing in front of this barn. Not the weathered gray version I had grown up knowing. The barn in the photograph was freshly painted red, the way it must have looked when his grandfather built it, when it was new and deliberately made and understood to be something that would stand for a long time. He was standing in front of it with his hand on the door frame, squinting slightly into the sun, the way people squint in photographs when the light is behind the camera. He was smiling. He looked like himself. The himself I remembered before the illness changed the way he moved through space. I picked up the folder with my full name on it and opened it. The first page was a cover letter from an attorney I didn't recognize, not Pelham, a different firm, with an address in the county seat. The letter was dated 11 months before my father died. It was addressed to me. It began, at the request of Owen Thomas Calloway. This office has prepared the following documentation establishing your full and legal ownership of the following assets. I read the first 2 lines. Then I sat down on the floor of that small dry room, my back against the shelving, the folder open in my hands, and I read every word of what my father had left me. Renata had said it was nothing. She had said it, and walked into that elevator, and gone back to the house on Sycamore, and arranged her things in the space that was now legally hers. She had assumed that handing over a half-acre and a rundown barn meant handing over nothing of consequence. What she had handed over was the most careful work of my father's last years. 3 years of restoration, documented and valued, and already spoken for. A project log that constituted a legal record of provenance. A set of buyer contacts that had been waiting for exactly this call. A hidden room behind the north wall where the most important documents were dry and safe and organized and waiting with my name on them. And behind all of that, a question I had not yet found the full answer to, one that the documents in my hands were only beginning to address. The fourth key had opened more than a room. My father had known things about his own estate that Renata did not know he knew. And in the months before he died, when the tremor was bad and the decisions were moving further from his hands, and the house on Sycamore was changing around him in ways he couldn't stop, he had put everything he could into the one place she would never look twice at. A worthless feed barn. Nothing. His whole careful life's most deliberate choice. I sat on the floor of that small room and held the folder with my name on it, and I thought about my father, who moved slowly because he believed most things worth doing were worth doing at the right pace. Who paid $12 for a coffee mug because some things are worth paying more for if they make you feel something in the morning. Who kept records of everything in small, even, consistent handwriting. Who knew his daughter well enough to know she would come. Who trusted, in the end, that she would. The documents in the folder were not complicated to read. They were complicated to absorb. My father had been working with an attorney named Sylvia Crane at the firm of Crane and Whitfield in the county seat, a separate firm entirely from Pelham's office, which had handled his general estate. I learned later that he had chosen Sylvia Crane specifically because she had no prior relationship with Renata, no connection to the estate process, and because she had a reputation for the kind of careful, unglamorous work that doesn't make headlines but holds up under scrutiny. He had gone to her 18 months before he died, driving himself on a Tuesday afternoon when Renata thought he had a doctor's appointment. He had told Sylvia Crane 2 things. The first was that he wanted to establish clear, documented ownership of the barn property in my name, separate from the estate, in a form that would survive any challenge. The second was that he needed help understanding what he was dealing with, financially, in terms of what he had built in that barn, and whether there was anything else he should know. The folder held the results of both requests. The ownership documentation was the first section. My father had executed a separate deed transfer for the half-acre parcel and barn structure, fully notarized, filed with the county recorder's office 11 months before he died, establishing my ownership of the property outright. Not through the will. Through a direct transfer, separate and complete, predating his death by nearly a year. The will had referred to the barn because it was the appropriate place to document his intentions, but the legal transfer had already happened. The barn had been mine before he died. Renata's approval, or Pelham's reading of the will, or the attorney's office on Birch Street had not created my ownership. They had simply confirmed what was already done. I read that section twice. The recording date, the county stamp, the notary seal, all of it clean, all of it prior. My father had done this while he was still well enough to drive himself to an appointment and sit across from an attorney and say what he wanted clearly. The second section of the folder was a valuation report. Sylvia Crane had connected him with an appraiser named Robert Fenwick out of Columbus, Ohio, who specialized in vintage agricultural equipment for the insurance and estate market. Fenwick had visited the barn 8 months before my father died, examined all 3 tractors and the harvesting machine, reviewed the restoration work, and produced a written appraisal. I found the summary page near the back of the valuation report. For machines, individual appraisals based on condition, provenance documentation, and current comparable sales in the specialty market. The Oliver 88, tractor number 2, fully restored, comparable auction results at $15,000 to $18,000 for machines in similar condition. Fenwick noted the quality of the restoration specifically. He wrote that the work reflected someone with unusual patience and attention to period accuracy. The harvesting machine, the 1920s-era grain separator that Hargrove in Pennsylvania had already expressed interest in, was appraised separately and at considerably more. Fenwick had noted that working examples of this particular model in this condition were genuinely rare, that most surviving units had been broken for parts decades ago, and that the restoration my father had completed was not merely cosmetic but mechanically sound. His appraised value was a range. The lower end of that range was the number Gus had told me at the diner. The upper end was higher. The third tractor, the 1930s John Deere that my father hadn't finished, was appraised in its current state and with a projected value upon completion. Even unfinished, it held value. Completed, it would be worth significantly more. Fenwick wrote that the partial restoration was of sufficient quality that whoever finished the work was building on a solid foundation. The fourth machine, a small early-century hay press that I hadn't noticed under its tarp in the far corner because it was partially obscured by the harvesting machine, had been appraised modestly but not trivially. I added the numbers on the summary page. Not the high estimates. The conservative ones, the lower ends of Fenwick's ranges, the ones he'd stake his professional name on without reservation. The sum was not a fortune. It was the kind of number that doesn't change the shape of a life entirely, but changes the pressure of it. The kind of money that, if handled carefully, means the next several decisions are made from stability rather than desperation. Enough to finish the John Deere. Enough to cover a year of modest living while the sales process moved. Enough to remove the feeling of standing on ground that someone else controls. My father had known the number. He had commissioned the appraisal. He had kept the report in the hidden room and left me the key to find it. He had wanted me to know what I was standing on. I sat on the floor of that small dry room for a long time. The dehumidifier ran its quiet cycle. The light from the single bulb my father had installed overhead, wired to a battery pack because there was no permanent electrical run to this part of the barn, stayed steady and yellow and warm. Outside, the March wind moved through the grass around the foundation with the particular sound of early spring, when everything is still more dead than alive, but starting to think about changing. I looked at the framed photograph again. My father young, in front of a red barn, squinting into the sun. The barn is behind him, and he is smiling, and there is no illness in his body and no one in his house who doesn't belong there. He is just a man standing in front of something his grandfather built, something that has been handed down and will be handed down again, and he knows it. And that knowing is in his posture and in his face and in the hand resting easy on the door frame like a man who is certain the thing he's touching is his. I put the photograph in the metal box. Then I put the folder in the metal box. I took the box and the notebook and I walked out of the hidden room and pulled the panel shut and locked it with the fourth key. I rehung the tarps over the machines. I did everything in the same order and the same care my father would have used, because it seemed like the right way to leave the space until I was ready to come back with a plan. At the car, I sat for a moment with the box on my lap. The number from Fenwick's summary page was still in my head. Conservative, documented, professional. The kind of number that would hold up in a conversation with a buyer, or an attorney, or a judge if it ever came to that. Renata had given this away. She had handed it over with patience and a reference to a storage unit on Route 9, and she had said it was nothing, and she had stepped into an elevator and let the doors close between us, and she had been wrong about every part of it. I drove back to Bess's house, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I wrote down every name in the notebook in a separate list on a piece of printer paper. The Ohio dealer. Hargrove in Pennsylvania. Dell Soward the machinist. Sylvia Crane at Crane and Whitfield. Robert Fenwick the appraiser. Gus Fenner. My father had not left me a barn. He had left me a network. People who knew the work and the machines and the market and the legal structure. People he had assembled over 3 years, carefully, one by one. Each one chosen for what they knew and what they could do. Each one brought in with the clear intention that eventually I would have to call them and they would need to know who I was. He had introduced me to all of them. In the letter, in the notebook, in the documents. He had done the introductions before he died so that when the time came I wouldn't be walking in cold. I picked up my phone and I called Sylvia Crane. Her assistant put me through in under 2 minutes, which told me she had been expecting the call. She had a brisk, warm voice, the voice of someone who is genuinely busy but has specifically carved out time for this conversation. "May Calloway," she said. "Your father told me you'd call when you were ready. He said it might take a little while, but that you'd come." "He knew me well," I said. "He talked about you every time he came in," she said, which was more often than most clients. Usually people come in once, handle the documents, and that's the relationship. Your father came back 4 times over the course of the year. Each time he thought of something else he wanted to make sure was in order. I looked at the list of names on the paper in front of me. "The deed transfer," I said. "The filing date. It predates the will reading by nearly a year. It does, she said. That was intentional. He wanted it complete and recorded before anything else happened with the estate. He didn't want the barn's ownership to be conditional on anything. Was he concerned it would be challenged? A brief pause. He was thorough, she said, and thorough people don't leave openings. He wanted the transfer to be the kind of thing that doesn't invite questions because there's nothing to question. A deed recorded 11 months before his death, properly executed, filed with the county. That's not an estate maneuver. That's a straightforward property transfer from a living owner to his adult daughter. I heard what she was saying, and what she wasn't saying. If someone tried to challenge it, I said, they'd be challenging a completed legal transfer with proper documentation, a recording stamp, and a clear filing date, she said. They'd also be explaining why they waited nearly a year after the transfer was complete to raise the issue. Courts tend to look at that kind of delay unfavorably. I wrote the word challenge on my piece of paper and drew a line through it. Renata doesn't know about any of this, I said. It was not a question. Your father handled his affairs at this office with complete privacy, Sylvia said. We had no contact with his estate attorney's office, and nothing we prepared was shared with anyone other than your father and you. He told me in the letter that he'd been coming here in secret, I said. He said he'd come to understand that what he kept separate was what he could be certain of. A quiet beat. He said something similar to me, Sylvia said. He came in the last time, about 3 months before the end, and he sat in the client chair and said, May will figure out the rest. I just need to make sure the foundation is right. She paused. He was very calm when he said it. The kind of calm that's not indifference. The kind that comes from having done what you set out to do. I set down the pen. Outside, one of Bess's neighbors was mowing a lawn, which seemed wrong for March, but the grass had been growing and people do what they can when they can. Ordinary sounds. Normal afternoon. What do I need to do next? I said. Sylvia Crane was practical and clear, the way my father had been, and I understood immediately why he had chosen her. She told me I needed to do several things in a specific order. First, obtain a certified copy of the deed from the county recorder's office. This would be my primary document in any conversation about ownership. Second, contact Fenwick to update the appraisal, since the original was now 8 months old and the market moved. Third, reach out to the buyers in the notebook to establish current interest. Fourth, make no large decisions about the machines until the updated appraisal was in hand. She said she could draft a simple letter of representation confirming my ownership and her firm's role, which would be useful if anyone raised questions about my right to access or use the barn property. Anyone, I said. Anyone, she confirmed. We finished the call. I circled Fenwick's name on my list. Then I called the number my father had written next to it in the notebook. Robert Fenwick answered on the third ring. He was a man of few extra words, the kind who skips the pleasantry and gets to the substance. Not from rudeness, but from the practical habit of someone who spends most of his time dealing with machines rather than people. He remembered the barn immediately. He asked about the John Deere, and I told him it was still in progress. He said good, because completion would move the value considerably, and he knew a man in the county who might be able to finish it. Del Soward, I said. A pause. Then a short laugh, the kind that implies respect. Your father told you about Del? He said. He told me about everything. I said. Then you know what you have, he said. I'm starting to, I said. He said he could come back for the updated appraisal the following week. He said to call him on Thursday to confirm the time and to make sure the barn was accessible. He said he'd bring his camera and update his notes on all 4 machines, including the John Deere in its current state. He said the market for this category of equipment had moved since the previous spring, mostly upward. I wrote upward next to the original numbers on my paper and put a circle around it. That evening, I called Del Soward. He was 81 years old, retired, and lived 4 miles south of the county seat in a house on 12 acres where he kept a workshop that he described, with complete lack of self-deprecation, as better equipped than most professional operations. He had worked as a machinist for 37 years at the County Public Works Department and had spent the years since retirement doing restoration work on vintage engines because, as he put it, he needed something to do that required full attention. He had worked with my father for 8 months. He had helped with the Oliver 88 specifically, sorting out a carburetor issue and rebuilding the magneto from parts he had sourced himself from a supplier in Minnesota. He knew the John Deere was incomplete. He had looked at it twice. Your father wanted me to wait until you came, he said. He said, don't start the John Deere without her. Said you might want to be part of it. I was quiet for a moment. Would you be willing to finish it? I said. Been waiting to, he said. Only question's timing. When can we meet? I said. Saturday morning I'm free, he said. Bring the key. I told him I would. After I hung up, I sat at the table for a while with all the names circled and connected on my paper, and for the first time since the morning on Sycamore Street when Renata told me I had until Friday, I didn't feel like I was trying to outrun something. I felt like I was building towards something. The difference in those two feelings is the difference between reacting and deciding, and I had been reacting for long enough. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The call from Renata came the following Tuesday. I had been expecting it, in the way you expect weather when you've been watching the sky. Not with certainty about the day or the hour, but with the knowledge that the conditions were right, and it was only a matter of when. She called at 9 in the morning. I was at Bess's kitchen table with my second coffee and the updated list, going through the sequence of things that needed to happen before Fenwick arrived on Thursday. I looked at the phone for a moment before I picked up. Her name on the screen, no different from any other name. Nothing in it to signal that this particular call was the one where things changed. I answered. I heard you've been at the barn, she said. No preamble. No opening pleasantry. She had decided something before she dialed. I could tell, and the something was directness. I have, I said. It's my property. A brief pause, the kind that contains a recalibration. Of course, she said. I'm not questioning that. I'm just surprised you've been spending so much time out there. There's really nothing to see. She said it again. Nothing. The same word, the same tone, the same patience. I thought about what was behind that patience. Whether it was genuine confidence or a habit of confidence that had not yet been tested by real information. It's been useful to get a sense of the space, I said. I wanted to ask you something, she said, shifting smoothly. The equipment that's stored out there. Some of it may have belonged to neighbors. Owen used to let people keep things there temporarily. I want to make sure we're clear on what's yours and what might need to go back to its original owners. I set down my coffee cup. This was interesting. She was trying to open a question about what I owned. Not confrontationally, not with accusation, but with the particular technique of raising doubt where there had been none. Temporary storage. Original owners. A question about provenance before I'd established mine publicly. I've had the contents of the barn professionally assessed, I said. Calm. Specific. True. Another pause. Longer this time. Assessed, she repeated. When? Recently, I said. And also 8 months ago, when my father commissioned a full appraisal. The pause that followed was different in quality from the ones before it. Not a recalibration. Something more fundamental. The sound of a person who has made an assumption and is suddenly aware that the assumption may have been wrong. I wasn't aware of any appraisal, she said. He handled it separately, I said. Through a different firm. I heard her exhale. Almost inaudible. But there. Well, she said, and her voice had changed just slightly. The patience was still there, but underneath it something had shifted. I think we should sit down and talk through some of this. There may be things in the estate that overlap with the barn property, assets that were considered together even if the title is separate. I don't think that's the case, I said, but I'm happy to have that conversation through our respective attorneys. Silence. May, she said. Softer now. There's no need to make this adversarial. I agree, I said, which is why I'd like to handle it formally, through the right channels, so there's no confusion later about what was agreed to informally. I heard the shift in that, too. Informally. I had just characterized exactly the kind of conversation she'd been setting up, the kitchen counter conversation, the elevator hallway conversation, the this is just a formality conversation. I had named it before she could use it. She said she'd be in touch, and the call ended. I set the phone down and looked at my list of names. Then I called Sylvia Crane's office and asked them to prepare the letter of representation. I'd set our respective attorneys, which meant I needed one clearly established as mine. Sylvia Crane was now that. I called her assistant and explained that Renata might reach out and that I wanted any communication about the barn property directed to Crane and Whitfield going forward. The assistant said she'd note it and confirm with Sylvia. I went back to my coffee. It had gone cold. I made fresh. Bess came in from her night shift at 8:30, the same hour she always did on days she worked overnight. She had the particular careful quietness of a person running on 3 hours of sleep and discipline rather than rest. She hung up her jacket and looked at me the way she always did, the quick reading of my face that happened without either of us acknowledging it. She called, Bess said. She called, I confirmed. Bess made toast. She sat across from me and ate it while I told her the main points of the conversation. She listened with the focused silence she uses when she's processing rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. She's going to push on the equipment, Bess said when I finished. She's already started, I said. Original owners, Bess said, as if testing the phrase. That's smart. It's just vague enough to create doubt without making a specific claim. She doesn't know yet that the appraisal exists, I said, or the letter of representation, or the deed transfer timeline. Bess ate her toast. Outside, the Tuesday morning was picking up, cars going past, someone's kid late for something, the ordinary urgency of a weekday. What happens when she finds out? Bess said. She recalibrates, I said. The question is what she decides to do from there. That was the part one didn't know yet. Renata was not a person who made obvious moves. She was a person who made quiet ones, patient ones, moves that looked like something else until they were already done. I had seen that in how the estate had been arranged, in how the house on Sycamore had changed in the years she was there, in how she had said nothing is wrong on the way out of the attorney's office, already certain she had what she needed. The question was whether what she didn't know about the barn was enough to change her calculation, and the answer depended on exactly how much she didn't know. I thought she didn't know about Sylvia Crane. I thought she didn't know about the deed transfer predating the will reading by 11 months. I thought she didn't know about the appraisal or Fenwick or the specific values of what was under those tarps. I thought she didn't know about the hidden room behind the north wall panel. But I had learned, over the past week, that my father had known things about his own estate that Renata didn't know he knew, which meant there were things she was certain of that might not be as certain as she assumed. And people who are used to being certain can be genuinely dangerous when they're uncertain. They don't always move toward caution. Sometimes they move faster. I needed the updated appraisal before she got any further into the question of what the barn contained. Fenwick arrived on Thursday exactly when he said he would, which I had expected, because the kind of man who answers his phone on the third ring and books appointments with specific times is the kind of man who arrives at them. He drove a white pickup with a cap on the bed and equipment cases in the back, and he walked into the barn with the easy authority of someone who had been there before and knew what he was looking at. He spent 2 hours with the machines. He moved around each one with his camera and his notebook and a small flashlight he used to check things I couldn't identify from where I stood. He asked me one question about the John Deere, whether I had verified that all the parts laid out on the canvas were original to the machine, and I told him the project log had documentation for each component. He looked at the project log for 10 minutes. He made notes. In the hidden room, I showed him Fenwick's original appraisal and the project log entries that post-dated it. He read without comment and handed them back and photographed several pages. When he was finished, we stood outside in the thin Thursday sun, and he looked at his notes. The market's moved, he said. You mentioned upward, I said. On the harvesting machine specifically, he said. There were 2 auctions in the past 8 months where comparable pieces sold above what I projected last spring. One in Illinois and one in the Mid-Atlantic. He named the figures. Both were above the upper end of his previous range. I kept my face still. The Olivers held, he said. Good machine, good restoration, consistent demand. The John Deere, completed, would be in the same territory as the Oliver or slightly above. The hay press is a specialty item, smaller market, but a specific kind of collector who pays well for the right piece. He closed his notebook. I'll have the updated appraisal to you by Monday, he said. Official format, signed, suitable for any purpose you need it for. Thank you, I said. He loaded his equipment back into the truck without ceremony. Before he got in, he paused. Your father did good work out here, he said. Not with the wistfulness that sometimes attaches to that kind of statement. Just as fact. Clear, direct. The work was good. He did, I said. Fenwick drove back down the Mill Creek Road track, and I stood in the flat March sunlight and looked at the barn and felt something I was still learning to locate clearly. Not grief. Something adjacent to it. The way 2 similar colors live next to each other on a spectrum, and you can distinguish them only if you look for a while. It was the feeling of being known by someone who is no longer there to be thanked. Del Soward arrived on Saturday morning in a truck older than mine, hitched to a flatbed trailer with a toolbox bolted to it. He was a small man, wiry, with white hair cut close and hands that moved with the particular economy of someone who has done fine mechanical work for 60 years and wasted nothing in that time. He shook my hand once, firmly, and went directly into the barn. He walked to the John Deere, without preamble, and crouched beside the components laid out on the canvas, and began reading the labels my father had written. He read every one in sequence without touching anything. Then he stood up and looked at the engine as a whole and made a sound that was not quite a word. He got it further than I expected when I saw it last, Del said. When was that? I asked. November, he said. I came by twice in the fall to check progress. He'd had some bad weeks in October. Hard to work with the hands. He looked at the components again. He pushed through. He got further than I'd have bet on. There was something careful in how he said that, something I recognized as respect expressed by a man who doesn't give it easily. He labeled everything, I said. He was thorough, Del said. He said it the same way Sylvia Crane had said it, in the same tone, as though the word was large enough to hold something beyond its own meaning. We spent 2 hours in the barn, Del examining the John Deere and explaining in plain language what remained to be done. He was not a man who talked in circles. He identified each task, estimated the time, told me which parts would need to be sourced and from where, and gave me his opinion on the probable final result. His opinion was positive, stated without excess. It'll be right, he said. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Depends on the magneto. I'll have to see it running before I commit to a timeline. What would it cost? I said. He gave me a number that was fair and specific. He had thought about it before coming. He was not a man who estimated vaguely. All right, I said. You want to start next week? He said. Yes, I said. He nodded and went back to looking at the engine. I left him there for a few minutes and walked to the south windows, the ones that let in the most light, and looked out at the half-acre around the barn. The scrub grass, still winter brown. The collapsed section of fence along the east side. The crabapple pressing against the siding at the corner. Nothing worth looking at from the outside. From here, though, looking out rather than in, I could see that the land ran clear to a low rise before it met the tree line. The rise caught the morning sun, and the grass there was already showing the first thin green of the season, the color that appears before you expect it, when the ground has been warming longer than the air has let on. I thought about my father driving out here on his better days, loading things into the truck in the early morning, before the store opened, before Renata was fully into the day's logistics. Coming out on the county road with something to do that was entirely his. Something she hadn't rearranged. Something that was just him, a man working on machines in a barn, rebuilding things that had been broken by time and neglect, returning them to what they were meant to be. I understood, standing at that window, that the barn had not only been a plan for me, it had also been something he needed. A place where the decisions were still his. Where the quiet was his kind of quiet, not the managed quiet of a house where things were shifting around him. Where the work of his hands was still good, even when the tremor made it slow. He had needed this place, and he had made sure I could keep it. Renata's next move came 4 days later, on a Wednesday, and it did not come from Renata directly. It came from a man who appeared at the barn on a Wednesday morning while Del was working on the John Deere and I was sitting on the workbench stool going through the project log. I heard tires on the gravel and the creak of the track gate, and then footsteps, and then a knock on the open barn door. A man in his mid-40s stood in the doorframe in pressed slacks and a jacket that was either slightly too warm for March or slightly too cold, the unresolved outfit of someone whose context had changed unexpectedly. He introduced himself as Craig Nestor. He said he was a property consultant and that he had been asked to assess the Mill Creek Road property for a prospective buyer. Del looked up from the engine. He looked at me. I looked at Craig Nestor. Who hired you? I said. The inquiry came through a broker, he said, with the careful evasion of someone who knows the answer but has been told not to lead with it. I'm the owner of this property, I said, and I haven't authorized any assessment. He shifted slightly. I understand that. I was told the property may be available. I'm just here for a preliminary look. You were told wrong, I said. The property is not available. Well, he said, with the patient manner of a man who expects resistance as a first position before the negotiation begins. If the price were right, these things sometimes move faster than people expect. They'll put down his wrench. He stood up, unhurried, and turned to look at Craig Nestor with the quiet, steady expression of a man who is 81 years old and has not spent any of those years tolerating nonsense from people in press slacks. He didn't say anything. He just looked. Craig Nestor looked back. Then he looked at me. I'd encourage you to think it over, he said. My client is serious and timely. Your client should instruct their broker to confirm ownership before sending anyone out, I said. And they should know that the property is not for sale. He took a card from his jacket pocket and set it on the edge of the workbench. He looked around the barn in the specific way of people who are trying to appear appraising rather than curious. Then he left. I listened to his tires on the gravel track. Then the sound of the county road. Dell picked up his wrench. She sent him, he said. It was not a question. Someone sent him, I said. Dell looked at the workbench. He looked at the metal box. He looked at the barn around him with the same slow sweep he'd used when he first arrived. Owen said something to me once, he said, returning to the engine. Said the thing about a barn is that from the outside it just looks like a barn. He paused, moving a component with care. Said nobody looks twice at a barn. He counted on that, I said. Smart man, Dell said. I picked up Craig Nestor's card and turned it over. On the back, in pen, he had written what I assume was meant to be a compelling opening figure. The number was an assessment of the property's land value, the half-acre, bare, without the machines, without the barn's contents, without any of what was under the tarps or behind the north wall panel. It was an assessment of the property as nothing. Renata had sent someone to price the nothing. She didn't know yet that the number was wrong. I put the card in my jacket pocket and called Sylvia Crane from outside the barn while Dell worked. Sylvia was unsurprised. She said this kind of move was common when someone realized a transfer had happened outside their control. The goal was to establish a negotiating position early, before the other party understood the full value of what they held. She said it didn't concern her from a legal standpoint, because my ownership was complete and documented, but she wanted to send a formal notice to Renata and her attorney confirming that any inquiries about the Mill Creek Road property should go through Crane and Whitfield. Let's put the boundaries in writing, Sylvia said. It stops the informal approach. Please, I said. While I had Sylvia on the phone, I mentioned Hargrove in Pennsylvania, the buyer who had contacted my father about the harvesting machine. I want to reach out to him, I said. Not to sell immediately, just to confirm the interest is current and get a sense of timing. That's reasonable, Sylvia said. But let Fenwick's updated appraisal arrive first. You want current numbers in your hand before you're in any conversation about price. Monday, I said. Call Hargrove Tuesday, she said. I went back inside. Dell was working with the focused patience of a man who does not hurry because hurrying is incompatible with precision. I sat back on the stool and looked at the project log and thought about the shape of the next 2 weeks. There was a version of this that moved fast, that called every buyer immediately and sold everything in rapid sequence, and took the money and resolved the situation decisively. There was another version that moved slowly, that waited for the updated appraisal and the letter from Sylvia and Dell's completion of the John Deere, and sold from a position of completeness rather than urgency. My father had moved slowly for 3 years. Carefully, one piece at a time. I was going to move the same way. On Sunday evening, Bess and I sat on her back porch after dinner with the temperature just above comfortable and a bottle of wine between us. The maple at the back fence was beginning to bud. The evenings were getting longer in the small, incremental way of early spring, each one holding the light a few minutes past when you expected dark. I told her about Craig Nestor and the formal notice from Sylvia Crane and the plan for Tuesday's call with Hargrove. Bess listened without interrupting. She's going to find out soon, Bess said. About the appraisal. About the machines. I know, I said. What happens then? I thought about it for a moment. Not the dramatic version of the answer, the confrontation and the accusations and the scene. The actual version. She realizes she gave it away, I said. That's the thing that matters. Not that I have it. That she gave it. She walked away from the barn because she believed it was nothing. She said it was nothing. She handed over the deed without a second look. And it wasn't nothing, Bess said. It was the most carefully planned thing my father ever did, I said. Bess drank her wine. The maple budded in the last of the evening light. She's going to want to undo it, Bess said. She can't, I said. The transfer's done. The appraisal's done. The machinery is documented. I paused. The only move she has is to try to argue that something in the barn wasn't my father's to give. that the machines belonged to someone else. The original owner's thing, Bess said, remembering the phrase from our earlier conversation. She doesn't have anything to support it, I said. The project log documents acquisition for every machine. The Ohio dealer has records. The estate auction in Indiana has records. I paused. She doesn't know about any of that. Bess was quiet for a moment. May, she said, when all of this comes out, when she understands the whole picture, what do you want to happen? It was the right question, and I took it seriously. I didn't want to punish her. That was the first thing I knew clearly. Whatever Renata had done in the years she had been in my father's life, whatever the degree to which she had shifted things in her direction, she had also been present for the hard years. She had driven him to appointments and managed the medications and kept the household running during the months when he couldn't. I didn't know how to weight those things against each other, and I wasn't sure it was my job to weigh them. I want to do what my father set up, I said. Sell the machines to people who understand what they are. Use the money to build something stable. That's what he was doing out there. That's what I want to finish. Bess nodded once. And Renata? She gave me the barn, I said. Everything that comes from it comes from that. She made the choice. I'm going to let it stand. The maple moved slightly in the evening air. Somewhere on the block, a door opened and closed. The ordinary punctuation of a neighborhood at rest. He knew you'd say something like that, Bess said. Probably, I agreed. Is that okay with you? She said. She was asking the real question now, the one beneath the practical one. Whether it was enough. Whether the barn and what it held and what it would become was enough for the larger thing that had been lost. I thought about the photograph in the metal box. My father young, in front of a red barn, hand on the door frame, certain of what he was touching. I thought about the letter on 4 pages, the handwriting careful and slow, compensating for the tremor. The first line, if you're reading this, you came to the barn. That's the first thing, and I'm glad. It's enough, I said. It was not the whole truth. Grief doesn't resolve that cleanly, and I knew it. But it was the part of the truth that mattered for what came next. Fenwick's updated appraisal arrived in my email on Monday at 11:15 in the morning. I opened it at Bess's kitchen table with the coffee still hot, and I read it carefully, the same way my father had kept records, the same way Dell read the parts labels, the same way you read anything that matters. The numbers were higher than I had expected, even accounting for Fenwick's warning about market movement. The harvesting machine in particular had moved considerably. Fenwick noted in his summary that he had tracked 2 comparable sales in the past 30 days, both of which had moved above his previous projections, and that the current appraisal reflected those comps. He included, at the end of his summary, a sentence that I read twice and then printed and folded and put in my jacket pocket. It is the appraiser's professional opinion that the restoration work reflected in these machines represents a quality of craft and attention to detail consistent with the higher end of the collector market, and that buyers in this category will recognize and compensate for that quality accordingly. My father had worked on those machines on bad days with a trimmer in his right hand, coming out in the early mornings when no one was watching, labeling every part and documenting every decision. And Robert Fenwick, who had been appraising vintage agricultural equipment for 23 years, had written that the work was consistent with the higher end of the market. I called Hargrove in Pennsylvania at 2 in the afternoon. He answered on the second ring with the alert precision of a man who has been waiting for a specific call without knowing when it would come. He said my father's name before I said mine, and there was something in his voice, a weight, a genuine response to loss rather than the performed version. He was a remarkable person, Hargrove said. I only communicated with him 3 times, but you could tell. He was, I said. We talked about the harvesting machine. Hargrove had not moved on. He had been looking for 6 years, and the machine my father had restored was the right one, the right condition, the right provenance. He asked about my timeline, and I told him I was in the process of settling the estate and expected to be in a position to discuss terms within a month. He said a month was fine. He asked whether the appraisal had been updated, and I told him it had. He asked the number. I told him the current appraised range, low to high. He said he would be at the high end. He said it immediately, without negotiation, the way people respond when they've been waiting long enough that the waiting itself becomes a factor in the price. He asked when he could see it in person. I told him to come when the barn was ready, probably 3 weeks, when the John Deere was finished and the full collection could be seen together. He said he'd arrange his calendar. After I hung up, I sat with the phone on the table in front of me. The high end. My father had written in the letter, after describing the machines and the project log and the buyers and the appraiser, a sentence that I had read, and then set down, and then come back to several times since. He had written it near the end of the letter, after the practical information, in the section where his writing changed slightly, became less structured, more like speech. He had written, Renata thought the barn was worthless. She may be right that it's not beautiful. It's not. But I learned something working out there that I should have understood a long time ago. The worth of a thing isn't in how it looks from the road. It's in what was put into it by the people who cared for it, and whether those people were paying attention when they did. I think you've always understood that, May. I'm just glad I left you somewhere to keep it. I folded the appraisal and put it with the letter in the metal box. Then I picked up the phone one more time and called Sylvia Crane. Hargrove confirmed, I said when she answered. High end of the current appraisal. A pause. Then, your father would be pleased. I think he would, I said. She said the formal notice had gone to Renata's attorney that morning, that any further contact about the Mill Creek Road property should now go through her office. She said she expected a response within the week, and that when it came, we would handle whatever it contained. We would handle it. I like that. The plural. I had come into this week with a letter and a metal box and 4 keys and a barn that everyone had decided was nothing. I was ending it with a certified deed transfer, an updated professional appraisal, a committed buyer at the top of the market, a machinist finishing the John Deere, and an attorney whose formal notice was sitting in Renata's attorney's inbox right now, patient and precise and impossible to ignore. My father had said he wasn't asking me to fight anyone. He was right that I wasn't fighting. But what I was doing, what had started in that barn on a gray March afternoon with a cold steel box on a workbench and an envelope with my name on it, was something he had planned for and believed in. And what was in that barn, behind the tarps and the north wall panel and the 4 labeled keys, was not nothing. It never had been. It was just waiting for someone to come and see it clearly. And that person, that Tuesday, with an appraisal and a committed buyer and an attorney with a formal notice in the field, was me. Renata's attorney's name was Gerald Foss. I learned this from the response that arrived at Sylvia Crane's office on Thursday, for days after the formal notice went out. Sylvia called me with the contents, reading carefully in the measured way she had of delivering information that required a particular quality of attention. Foss had written that his client wished to discuss certain aspects of the Mill Creek Road property transfer, specifically the provenance and ownership status of personal property currently housed on the premises. He cited a concern that some equipment stored at the barn predated his client's marriage to Owen Calloway and may have belonged to third parties whose claims had not been extinguished at the time of the property transfer. He requested a meeting between all parties to clarify the matter. Sylvia read this twice, then set it down. She's going to argue the equipment doesn't belong to you, I said. She's going to try to open that question, Sylvia said. Which is different. She doesn't have a claim. She's creating a conversation. What does that give her? Delay. Uncertainty. The possibility that you'll settle something informally to make the conversation stop. I thought about Craig Nestor and the number he'd left on the back of his card. The assessment of the land as bare, as nothing. Renata didn't know what the machines were worth. She was operating on the assumption that the equipment was either junk or modestly valuable farm surplus. She was trying to introduce a complication that would let her negotiate from a position she didn't yet understand was built on wrong numbers. What do we do? I said. We respond formally, Sylvia said. We reference the project log. We reference the acquisition records your father kept. We reference the Ohio dealer and the estate auction documentation, which your father kept copies of, by the way. They're in the folder. I thought about the folder in the metal box. The second section I hadn't fully read, the section behind the valuation report. I had stopped at the appraisal numbers and hadn't kept going. I went back to Bess's house that afternoon and sat at the table and opened the folder and read the rest. My father had kept receipts, acquisition documents, photographs taken at the estate auction in Indiana on the day he bought the 2 tractors, his own face visible in one of them beside the auctioneer's stand, the John Deere on the block behind him. A bill of sale from the retired farmer in Crane County for the harvesting machine, signed and dated, the price listed as $1,200 for what the farmer had described as an old threshing machine, not knowing what it was. A letter from the Ohio dealer confirming the purchase of parts, referencing specific machine serial numbers. Correspondence with an antique equipment society in Columbus documenting the restoration of the Oliver 88 for their records. Every machine had a paper trail, not because my father had anticipated a legal challenge specifically, because he kept records of everything he did, because that was who he was. I called Sylvia back. There's a complete acquisition file, I said. Every machine documented. Bills of sale, auction records, dealer correspondence, photographs at point of purchase. A pause that carried satisfaction in it without stating it. Send me everything, she said. I drove to the county recorder's office the following morning and picked up the certified copy of the deed transfer. It was a single-page, heavy stock, official in the particular way of government documents, stamped and signed and dated 11 months before my father died. I held it in the parking lot for a moment before I put it in the folder with the rest. Ownership. Complete. Prior. Documented. The kind of thing that doesn't invite questions because there is nothing to question. On the drive back, I passed the store on County Road 7. The parking lot was mostly empty at 9 in the morning. Through the window, I could see the new fixtures, the updated signage my father had not chosen. I had not been inside since the funeral, when Gus had unlocked it for the reception, and we had stood in the back near the feed inventory with our paper cups and said the kinds of things that are said at those gatherings. I was not avoiding it deliberately. I just hadn't needed to go. But I slowed down as I passed, and I looked at the hand-lettered original sign that was still there on the east-facing wall. The original signage that the renovation hadn't touched because it faced the field rather than the road. Calloway Feed and Hardware. The letters faded but legible. 30 years of sun and weather. Still there. He hadn't been able to keep everything, but he had kept what he could protect. I drove on. Sylvia sent the formal response to Gerald Foss that Friday. I read the draft before she sent it. It was not aggressive. It was not warm. It was precise in the way of a document that knows it does not need to raise its voice because the facts are sufficient. It referenced the deed transfer with filing date and county recording number. It referenced the acquisition documentation for all 4 machines with supporting records attached. It stated clearly that the personal property housed on the Mill Creek Road premises was the lawfully purchased and documented property of Owen Thomas Calloway, transferred to May Elaine Calloway through a completed legal deed, and that no third-party claims had been identified in the acquisition record. It invited Foss to identify specifically any equipment he believed to have third-party ownership, along with supporting documentation. She sent it on a Friday because Friday responses land in offices when the week is winding down and the momentum is already gone from it. They sit over the weekend when no one can call a meeting or make a quick decision, and by Monday the other side has had 2 days to look at what they received and understand what it means. Sylvia had been doing this for 27 years. She knew exactly when to send a letter. I spent that weekend at the barn. Del came both days. On Saturday, he finished the magneto work on the John Deere, which had been the piece he was least certain about, and on Sunday afternoon he told me to stand back. He had the engine assembled. He connected the battery. He adjusted something at the carburetor that I couldn't see clearly from where I was standing, made a sound of evaluation under his breath, and then said start her up. I turned the key. The John Deere started on the second attempt. Not dramatically, not with a roar. It started the way old engines start when they have been carefully built, with a low, rough cough that steadied itself almost immediately into an even, deliberate rhythm. The sound filled the barn. Del stood with his arms crossed and listened to it the way a man listens to something he wants to understand completely. Running clean, he said. I stood beside that tractor and listened to it run and thought about the last time my father had been in this barn. Some afternoon in the fall, the parts laid out on the canvas in their careful sequence, the labels written on the masking tape, everything organized for the next visit that didn't come. I thought about him driving home on that last afternoon without knowing it was the last one. The way that happens without announcement, the last time for things before they are finished. He had not finished it, but it was finished. The magneto turned. The engine ran. The thing he had built from a broken machine and a project log and 3 years of early morning work was running in a barn on Mill Creek Road, and my father wasn't there to hear it, and I stood with my hand on the metal of the hood and let that be what it was. Del didn't say anything. He understood the moment well enough to leave it alone. After a while, I turned the engine off. The barn went quiet. Outside, the March wind was in the grass. Thank you, I said. Thank your father, Del said. He did the hard part. He packed his tools with the economy of a man who has been packing tools for 60 years and never developed a preference for ceremony about it. At the door, he paused the way he sometimes did when he had something left to say. "You going to sell it?" he said. Not accusatory, just a question. "The harvesting machine first," I said. "Hargrove is coming next week. The Oliver I'm thinking about carefully. The John Deere I haven't decided." He nodded once, looked at the tractor for a moment. "Your father used to say the John Deere was the one he built for himself," Del said. "Not for any buyer. Just because he wanted to see if he could get it right." He got in his truck and drove down the track without ceremony. I stood in the doorway of the barn and looked at the finished tractor, green and exact, the engine still warm. The work my father had started and not been able to finish. The work I had watched a man 3 times my age complete on a Sunday afternoon in a county barn where nobody would have thought to look. He had gotten it right. Gerald Foss's response to Sylvia's letter arrived on Tuesday. Sylvia called me at 10 in the morning, the same brisk, warm voice, but with something lighter underneath it now. "He's identified one piece of equipment," she said. "A hay rake he claims belonged to a neighboring farm prior to your father's ownership of the barn." "The hay press?" I said. "No. A separate piece he's describing as a hay rake stored at the back of the property. He's requesting documentation of ownership." I thought about this. I walked through the barn in my head, machine by machine, tarp by tarp. I had done a full inventory in the first week and written it in the back of the project log notebook. There was no hay rake. There was no piece that fit that description. "I don't think that piece exists," I said. "That's my read too," Sylvia said. "He's creating a small, specific, plausible-sounding claim in order to establish a foothold in a conversation about the barn's contents. If we engage with it as though it might be valid, it invites further claims. And if we don't engage, we respond that we have conducted a full inventory of the property and the piece he describes is not among the contents. We invite him to provide the name of the purported original owner so we can verify whether any prior storage arrangement was made. We already know there isn't one, because your father's project log documented every item in that barn." She paused. "They're fishing, May. They don't have anything." "Because she handed it over," I said. "Because she handed it over," Sylvia agreed. "And now she's trying to retrieve what she can without admitting that's what she's doing." There was something precise in that. Renata had been in control of the situation from the moment my father got sick, moving quietly and patiently, and in the right order through years of decisions that had slowly rearranged things in her direction. She had done it well enough that by the end almost no one was in a position to question it. The attorney's office on Birch Street had confirmed what she already had. The estate had gone the way she had prepared it to go, except for the barn. She had looked at it and said nothing, and handed it over without a second thought, because it was nothing, because she had been certain it was nothing, and that certainty had felt so complete to her that she had not considered the alternative. And now she was writing letters through an attorney, describing equipment that didn't exist, trying to open a door she had already closed herself. "Send the response," I said. The week before Hargrove's visit, I cleaned the barn. Not deeply, not in a way that changed the essential character of the space. I swept the concrete floors, cleared the scattered debris of Dell's work from around the John Deere, refolded the tarps, and set them against the wall in the orderly way my father would have. I wiped down the shelving. I replaced the spent light bulb in the hidden room. I looked at the framed photograph on the shelf in there, my father young in front of the red barn, and I set it more squarely on its shelf. The barn did not need to be something it wasn't. Hargrove was coming because he knew what he was coming to see. He had been looking for 6 years, and he understood the machines he was looking for, and he did not need the barn to be presentable in a way that obscured what it was. He needed it to be honest. Clean and organized and honest. That was something I knew how to do. I also drove to the county recorder's office a second time, not to pick anything up, but to make sure the deed was in their system the way Sylvia said it was. The clerk pulled it up in under 2 minutes, looked at the screen, looked at me, and said it was right there. Recorded 11 months before the date of death. Clean and clear. "Is there any flag on it?" I asked. "No flag," she said. "No liens, no encumbrances. Clean title." I thanked her and walked out into the parking lot where the early April sun was finally doing something other than existing. There was actual warmth in it. The kind you feel on your face after a winter of going through the motions of sunlight without any of the substance. April. I had been in the county for 5 weeks. In that time, I had called 6 people, read a deed transfer and an appraisal and a project log and a letter written by my father in the handwriting of a man fighting a tremor, opened a hidden room, met an 81-year-old machinist, stood beside a running John Deere, and blocked every informal approach Renata had tried to make. I had also, in those 5 weeks, given my notice at the landscape firm in the city. My manager had been understanding. He said to take the time I needed. I told him I thought what I needed was time that was mine to use differently, and he had been gracious about it in the way that some people are when they see a decision being made from a position of clarity rather than crisis. I had nowhere permanent to live yet. That was a real problem and a solvable one, and I had not solved it yet because I was doing things in the right order, the way my father did things, one piece at a time, the next decision informed by the last. Hargrove arrived on a Thursday morning. He drove a dark blue pickup, clean, practical, the vehicle of a man who uses trucks for the purposes they were designed for. He was in his late 60s, gray-haired, with the careful way of moving that I associated with people who handle valuable things regularly. He introduced himself quietly, shook my hand, and asked if he could see the barn. I opened the door for him. He walked in and stopped. He stood in the entrance for perhaps 10 seconds, not moving, just looking. His eyes went to the harvesting machine first, still under its canvas, the large shape of it visible, even covered. Then to the Oliver. Then to the John Deere, now complete. Then to the shelving and the organized tools and the concrete floor and the light coming through the south windows. He really did it, Hargrove said. Not to me exactly. More to himself. He did, I said. I lifted the tarp on the harvesting machine slowly. Hargrove stood beside me, and we uncovered it together without speaking. When the canvas was folded back and the full machine was visible in the morning light, he put his hand on the side of it the way you put your hand on something you have been trying to find for a long time and have finally located. He looked at it for a long while. He walked around it. He crouched and looked at the underside of the mechanism, and he asked me questions about specific components, and I read him the corresponding entries from the project log, which answered each question precisely and in my father's words. He photographed everything. He looked at the original acquisition bill of sale, the one from the retired farmer in Crane County who had called it an old threshing machine and sold it for $1,200 not knowing what he had. Hargrove stood up and looked at the bill of sale for a moment after he finished reading it. Your father paid $1,200 for this, he said. He did, I said. Hargrove folded the document carefully and handed it back. He knew, Hargrove said. When he bought it, he knew exactly what he had. He did, I said. Hargrove looked at the machine again. I called him 3 times, he said. First time he said he was exploring options. Second time, he said the restoration was ongoing and he wasn't ready to discuss sale. Third time, he said he had a family matter to sort through and he'd be in touch. He was quiet for a moment. He never called again. He got sick, I said. I know, Hargrove said. I found out eventually through the equipment network. I sent a card to the estate. He paused. I didn't know about you. He kept things separate, I said. Hargrove looked at me directly. He was protecting this for you. It was not a question. He understood it the same way Gus had understood it, and Dell had understood it, and Sylvia Crane had understood it from the first phone call. My father had not been keeping secrets in the diminished sense of the word. He had been managing information with the care of a man who understood that the wrong information in the wrong hands before the right time would cost something he wasn't willing to pay. We walked through the rest of the barn. Hargrove looked at the Oliver and said it was a beautiful restoration, said it twice, the second time with the specificity of someone naming the exact elements that made it right. He looked at the John Deere and asked who finished the engine work, and I told him about Dell, and he nodded in the way of someone who already knew of Dell Soward by reputation. He looked at the hay press and made notes. We went outside and stood in the April morning, and he told me what he wanted to offer for the harvesting machine. The number was at the top of Fenwick's updated range, not above it. Right at the top, stated clearly and directly, the way Hargrove operated. He did not offer below and wait to be negotiated up. He said what the machine was worth to him, and that was the number. I looked at the barn for a moment before I answered. My father had bought that machine for $1,200 because he knew what it was, and the seller didn't. He had spent months rebuilding it, on bad days with a trimmer in his hand, because he believed that things built with attention were worth attending to. He had documented every hour and every dollar and hidden the records in a room behind the north wall where Renata would never look, because he was protecting this for me. And he had been right to protect it, and the number Hargrove was offering was the proof. "I'll have Sylvia Crane send you the paperwork," I said. Hargrove shook my hand again, both hands this time, the grip of someone who means it. "Tell me something," he said, before he got in his truck. "The other machines. The Oliver, the John Deere. Are those for sale?" "Not yet," I said. "Maybe eventually. I'm thinking about the John Deere separately." "If you decide," he said, "call me first. Not because I expect to buy them, just because I'd like to know what happens to them." He drove down the Mill Creek Road track, and I watched the truck until it disappeared at the county road. The Magneto Dell had rebuilt, turned in the John Deere. The Oliver stood under its tarp. The hay press sat in the corner where it had sat for 3 years, patient as an old piece of machinery can be patient, which is to say perfectly patient. The hidden room behind the north wall was locked again with the 4th key. And the harvesting machine, the 1920s-era grain separator my father had bought for $1,200 from a man who didn't know what he had, was sold to a collector who had been looking for it for 6 years, at the price my father had expected it to fetch, from a barn his wife had handed over because she was sure there was nothing in it. Sylvia Crane had the sale documents prepared by Friday. Hargrove signed from Pennsylvania via courier. The funds transferred cleanly on Monday morning. I was at Bess's kitchen table when the confirmation came through on my phone, and I sat there for a moment with the screen in my hand, and then I set it face down on the table and made a second cup of coffee and stood at the window looking at the maple in the back, which was fully in bud now. The green of it urgent, and particular the way spring green is, nothing like summer green, everything still becoming. The number in my account was more than I had earned in any single year of my working life. It was not enough to stop working. It was enough to make the next decisions from a place that was not urgency, to think carefully about what I wanted the next years to look like before the months made the choice for me. My father had built that for me, standing in a barn in the cold on bad days, compensating for a tremor, labeling every part and documenting every hour, because he wanted me to have ground to stand on. The response from Gerald Foss came the following week. Not a letter this time, a withdrawal, polite in the language of legal correspondence, which is to say not warm but not openly hostile. His client was satisfied with the documentation provided, and no further inquiry into the equipment provenance was necessary. He wished Miss Calloway well with the estate. Sylvia called to tell me. "That's it," I said. "That's it," she said. "There's nothing left for her to claim. The deed is clean. The acquisition records are clean. The sale is complete. The legal structure your father built holds in every direction she could push." I looked at the piece of paper on the table in front of me, the one with all the names circled and connected. Sylvia, Fenwick, Gus, Delegate Hargrove, the Ohio dealer. Every person my father had carefully assembled over 3 years, each one knowing their part, each one waiting for the call. Did she ever understand what was in there? I said. "I don't know," Sylvia said. "She may have gotten there by the end. The appraisal information would have become visible through the sale process. She would have seen the transfer amount." A pause. "She made a decision based on incomplete information, and it can't be undone. Whether she understands that fully is between her and herself." I had thought about Renata a fair amount in the weeks since the formal notice, not with the particular bitterness that would have been available to me if I'd wanted to reach for it. I had thought about her the way you think about a thing that happened and cannot unhappen, trying to understand the shape of it clearly enough to set it down. She had moved through my father's life with patience and competence, and, in the years when it mattered practically, she had been there. She had managed things that needed managing. I did not know how to weigh that against the other things, and I had decided I didn't need to. The law had already weighted in my father's favor, because my father had been careful and thorough, and she had assumed certainty she didn't have. She had the house on Sycamore. She had the store, though the store had changed enough that it was not quite the same thing my father had built. She had what the estate gave her, and it was not nothing. The estate, through Pelham's reading of the will, had been arranged in her favor, except for the half-acre on Mill Creek Road, except for the barn, the one thing she had walked away from because she was certain it was worthless. That was the thing. Not the money, not the legal outcome, not the formal notice from Sylvia Crane that had stopped her informal approaches. The thing that would settle in her eventually, when the dust was finished and the legal correspondence stopped, and she had time to think about the sequence clearly. She had given it away herself. My father had understood her well enough to know she would. He had planned around that understanding, and he had been exactly right. I folded the paper with the names on it and put it in the drawer with the rest. 3 weeks after the harvesting machine sale, I drove to the county seat and met with a real estate agent about the rental market. I was thinking about the barn property, not selling it. I had made that decision quietly and without much drama during the week after Hargrove left, sitting on the workbench stool in the late afternoon light, looking at the Oliver and the John Deere and the space my father had built over 3 years of careful, private, deliberate work. I was not going to sell the land. What I was thinking about was something different. The barn needed work on the roof, properly this time, not the patch job it had gotten at some point in the last decade. The concrete floor sections needed extension, both of the unfinished areas at the far end of the space. The south windows needed resealing. There was electrical work that should have been done years ago. Done properly, the barn would be a functioning workshop, dry and lit and organized, the kind of space where serious work could be done. I had the money to do it right. The real estate agent was a practical woman named Lois who had grown up in the county and knew the property values and the market the way people know things they've spent decades paying attention to. She looked at the Mill Creek Road parcel and told me the land was worth what I expected and the barn's improved value depended on the work I was describing. "You're thinking about staying," she said. It wasn't a question exactly, more of an observation. "I'm thinking about it," I said. I drove out to the property that afternoon and sat in the car for a while, looking at the barn from the outside the way Renata had looked at it. Gray boards, overgrown foundation, crab apple pressing at the corner. From the road, nothing. My father had known that was what people would see. He had counted on it, used it, built around it for 3 years. And now I was sitting in a car looking at it, and thinking about roof work and electrical and concrete. Thinking about what you do with a space someone built carefully for you when you're not sure yet what careful thing you want to build inside it. I didn't have the answer yet, but I had the ground to stand on while I found it. I went back to Bess's that evening, and we sat at the kitchen table after dinner, and I told her I was thinking about staying in the county. She put down her fork. "Tell me more," she said. "I don't know the full shape of it yet," I said. "The barn needs work. I'm thinking about what to do with it long term. I'm thinking about whether there's something to build here." I paused. "I've been running from things since I left for the city. I don't think that's the direction I want to keep moving." Bess looked at me for a moment. "Your father would like that," she said. "Probably," I said. "What would you do?" she said. "For work." "The landscape architecture background is not going anywhere," I said. "Remote work is real. And I'm thinking about the barn itself. Dell mentioned last week that there are 3 other restoration projects sitting in county barns right now with no one who knows how to move them. Machines that are sitting because the people who inherited them don't know what they have." Bess understood that immediately. I could see it in her face. "You'd broker it," she said. "Connect the machines with people who can restore them. Or restore them yourself. Or bring in people like Dell," I said. "The network already exists. My father built it. I just have to understand it well enough to use it." It was not a fully formed plan. It was an outline. The kind of thing that requires a lot of work before it becomes a business rather than an idea. But my father had started with an outline too, 3 years before, standing in an empty barn with a project log and a list of names and the quiet certainty that if he did the work carefully enough, the outcome would be right. He had been correct. The magneto turned. The engine ran. The grain separator had sold to a man who'd been looking for it for 6 years. The Oliver 88 stood under its tarp, fully restored, the correct green of a meadow green original, waiting for whatever decision I made about it next. And the John Deere. Dell had told me my father called it the one he built for himself. The one he built not for any buyer, but because he wanted to see if he could get it right. He had gotten it right, with Dell's help, and now it was finished and running in mine. I had not decided what to do with the John Deere. What I had decided was that I was not in a hurry to decide. That was its own kind of answer, the kind that tells you something about the relationship you're building with a thing. When you're not in a hurry to sell something, you're not thinking of it as a transaction. You're thinking of it as something that belongs where it is. Gus came by the barn on a Saturday in late April. He brought coffee in paper cups from the diner on Elm, handed me one without ceremony, and we stood in the doorway of the barn looking at the interior the way you look at a place you've been thinking about. He hadn't been here since my father's last month. He had stayed away. The same way you stay away from a thing that is too close to something that hurts. And then one Saturday, he had driven out and knocked on the open door and handed me a cup of coffee. We didn't talk about much in particular. He asked about the sale of the harvesting machine, and I told him the number. He nodded, not surprised. He'd known what the machine was worth. He walked slowly around the John Deere, looking at Dell's work, touching the engine block once briefly. He would have been proud of that, he said. Dell did good work, I said. Owen too, Gus said. You don't get to take that away from him by saying Dell finished it. He built the foundation. Dell put the last piece in. That's still Owen's machine. He drank his coffee. Outside, the April morning was doing its work. The grass around the barn foundation had gone properly green. The crabapple at the corner had bloomed, small white flowers pressing against the old gray siding in a way that was either determined or oblivious, and probably both. What happens to it now? Gus said. I don't know yet, I said. He nodded. That was the right answer, and he knew it. Your father had a word for this kind of situation, Gus said. When a thing was done and the next thing wasn't clear yet. He looked at the tractor. He called it the good waiting. Said it was different from the anxious waiting. Said you only got to the good waiting when you'd finished what needed finishing, and you could afford to take your time about what came next. I held my coffee cup and looked at the John Deere and thought about my father on a Tuesday afternoon, driving himself to an attorney's office while Renata thought he was at the doctor's. Thinking all of that through. Labeling the parts in careful sequence. Writing a letter in the handwriting of a man compensating for a tremor, for pages, starting with if you're reading this, you came to the barn. The good waiting. I had things to do. The roof needed a contractor. The electrical needed an assessment. I had 2 phone calls to make about a restoration inquiry Dell had passed along. A family in the next county who had found a 1940s corn sheller in a collapsing barn and didn't know what it was worth or who to call. I had a conversation to have with a remote work attorney about structuring something small and independent. I had decisions to make about the Oliver that I wasn't ready to make yet and didn't have to be. But right now, on a Saturday morning in late April with paper cups of diner coffee and the crabapple in bloom against the siding, I was in the good waiting. It was different from what I'd been doing before I found the barn. Before I drove out on a gray March afternoon and lifted a steel bar and pulled open a door and stood in the low light while my eyes adjusted to a space that was not nothing and had never been nothing, waiting for someone who understood that to come and see it. I had come and seen it. Sylvia Crane closed the formal file on the Mill Creek Road matter at the end of April. She sent me a brief letter noting that all outstanding legal questions had been resolved, that the deed transfer stood unchallenged, that the sale of the harvesting machine had been completed with proper documentation, and that the file was being marked closed unless I had further needs. She added one line at the end, outside the formal language, in what I recognized as her own voice rather than the voice of a letter. Your father built something worth finding. I'm glad you found it. I folded the letter and put it in the metal box with the other things. The 4 pages of my father's handwriting. Fenwick's summary page with the word upward circled. The photograph of a young man in front of a red barn, hand on the door frame, certain of what he was touching. The box was getting full. I would need somewhere more permanent to keep these things. That was a problem I was glad to have. I drove to the barn on a Friday morning, the last Friday of April, early enough that the dew was still on the grass. I unlocked the door and propped it open and stood for a moment in the entrance, the way I stood in it the first time, letting my eyes adjust. The Oliver under its tarp. The John Deere finished, and still, the correct green of it visible even in the low light. The shelving with my father's organized containers. The concrete floor he had poured and leveled himself. The seams between the concrete and the old dirt precise and deliberate. The south windows with the morning light starting to come through them in the flat gold way of early morning, casting long shadows from the sills across the floor. The 4th key on its hook. The hidden room with its dehumidifier and its shelves and its photograph. My father's barn. My barn. Not nothing. Not the worthless inheritance Renata had handed over with a reference to a storage unit on Route 9. Not the nothing she had said it was in an elevator with the doors closing. Not the bare half-acre Craig Nestor had priced on the back of a business card. Not any of the versions of this place that people had decided it was from the outside, based on weathered siding and overgrown grass and the particular gray color of old wood that makes people assume the story is over. It had always been this. All of it, under the tarps and behind the north wall, and in the project log, and in the letter on 4 pages. My father had put it here and kept it here and trusted that I would come. I walked to the workbench and sat on the stool. The barn was quiet around me. Outside, a bird was working at the crabapple. The morning light moved as it does, the slow arc of it through the south windows, tracking across the floor. I opened the project log notebook to the last entry my father had written. The handwriting was the worst of any entry in the book, the tremor having its worst effect, the letters still legible but effortful, each one a small negotiation between intention and the limitations his body had started to impose. The entry was dated 3 weeks before he died. October 14th. One line. Left the Magneto for Delaware. He knows what to do. That was all. He had run out of days before he ran out of things to say, so he had said the essential thing. Left the Magneto for Delaware. He knows what to do. Dell had known what to do. I sat on the stool in my father's barn on a Friday morning in late April with the light coming through the south windows, and the bird working at the crabapple, and the John Deere finished, and still against the north wall, and I held the project log open to the last entry, and I let the morning be what it was. Then I closed the notebook, put it back in the box, stood up. I had a contractor to call about the roof, an electrical assessment to schedule, 2 phone calls about the corn sheller in the next county, a family who didn't know what they had and needed someone to tell them. The good waiting was over. Not because everything was resolved. Everything is never fully resolved. It was over because the next thing had made itself clear. My father had not left me a barn and asked me to preserve it unchanged. He had left me a foundation and trusted me to build from it. He had assembled the people and the documents and the legal structure and the machines and the project log and the 4 keys and the hidden room with its dehumidifier running quietly in the dark. And he had put my name on an envelope and left it on a workbench in the center of a half-acre that was already mine before he died. He had done all of that, so I would have somewhere to start. Not somewhere to stop. Somewhere to start. I picked up the metal box and walked toward the door. The morning air outside was clean and cool, the kind of April air that still remembers winter but is no longer defined by it. The grass was green across the rise. The tree line held the edge of the property in the way it had always held it, the way it would hold it after I was gone, the way it had held it when this barn was red and new and a man stood in front of it squinting into the sun. I locked the door. The bar settled into its brackets with the particular sound of iron in iron, the same sound it had made every time my father locked it. Every morning he drove away from here and left the work for the next time. There would be a next time. I walked to the car. The box went on the passenger seat, the same place it had been on the first night I drove away from here with the letter unread and the machines unknown, and the 4th key, still a mystery I hadn't solved yet. I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel and looked at the barn through the windshield. Gray boards, overgrown foundation, crab apple blooming at the corner. From the outside, still nothing. From the inside, everything my father had been able to protect. I started the car and drove down the Mill Creek Road track toward the county road, gravel under the tires, bare trees full now. Everything changed from the March afternoon when I first made this drive. At the end of the track, I stopped and looked both ways and turned toward town. Behind me, the barn sat at the edge of the half-acre in the April morning, locked and quiet, and exactly what it was. Not what anyone had decided it was from the road. What it actually was. My father had spent 3 years making sure I knew the difference. I did. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.